And welcome back, everyone. Thanks for watching. For this episode, we'll take a look at the planning and execution of British Joint Force logistics in support of the Falkland Islands War. The British task force was faced with the daunting challenge of projecting force some 8,000 miles south to the Malvinas, and did so within 72 hours of Thatcher's announcement that Britain would be mobilizing a task force in response to Argentina's invasion. So let's get started. To begin this analysis, we'll start 8,000 miles north, up at Britain's Portsmouth Harbor, where the task force assembled and the preliminary logistics coordinations were made. Portsmouth Harbor is a large natural harbor in Hampshire, England, that is best known as the home to the Royal Navy. Due to its narrow entrance and location at the south of England, it has been a strategic center for Britain's Navy since the Middle Ages. Portsmouth Harbor would launch the majority of Royal Naval vessels and commercial ships that participated in the Falklands War, including the aircraft carriers the Hermes and the Invincible, the assault ships the Intrepid and the Fearless, several other patrol ships, frigates, and auxiliary ships. So let's take a look at the Portsmouth Inner Harbor. That's why I like Google Maps. It's actually pretty accurate, and you'd be amazed with the accuracy and what's displayed as far as open source. So also at Portsmouth were all the critical logistics support vessels, amphibious vessels, and essential equipment such as causeway sections. The assault vessels, more accurately the landing platform dock ships, the Hermes and the Invincible, survived the budget cuts of the early 80s, as these ships facilitated the amphibious landings that would be an essential part of the maneuver plan for the Royal Marines. These vessels carried 4 LCUs, or landing craft utility boats, in their docks, as well as 4 landing craft vehicle personnel boats that were lowered by booms. Also out of Portsmouth were the Royal Navy's 4 landing ship logistics, or LSLs. These 6 ships would provide a decent logistics backbone, but more was needed. So planners turned to the commercial industry and activated their version of the Civil Reserve Fleet with what was called Ships Taken Up from Trade, or STUFT, S-T-U-F-T. The STUFT program would activate 54 civilian ships through requisition and several more through private charter. The administrative burden alone was tremendous, but the coordination and preparation of these vessels for sailing 8,000 miles was even more burdensome. Then the enduring operation in the South Atlantic high seas, as you know, the war, the Operation Corporal, was approaching summer, which means high seas, was substantial. Doing all of this within a week or even weeks seems impossible, but it was done somehow. The civilian vessels were primarily used, previously as ferries and then used locally, regionally, in the Channel exclusively. They all had to receive upgrades, primarily ballast modifications, in order to have the range, endurance, and seakeeping qualities of other transatlantic vessels. Meanwhile, the ground force portion of the task force was growing and now included nearly 4,500 Marines, paratroopers, and Special Forces commandos. The amphibious ships could not hold these 4,500 men, which was growing. So, in another important requisition, the ocean liner Canberra was acquired and utilized as the primary troop transport for the growing task force. Just up the Solent waterway from Portsmouth in the Southampton water is the Marchwood dockyard, which was another crucial organizing area where the 6 LSLs and the 17th Port Regiment resides. The handling of explosives and Class 5 prep and loading was done at Marchwood. The Ro-Ro capability resides up this way as well, and there were at least 4 Ro-Ro vessels used to transport vehicles and aircraft from this location. I've really only scratched the surface of the complexity involved in organizing the fleet assembly, troop transport, and preliminary commodity prep involved in the early days of this conflict. As the fleet prepared to depart, some elements as early as 72 hours after announcement, it was realized that the real logistical challenges began to emerge, such as the fact that fuel could not be obtained from South American countries as the geopolitical landscape was tense and other nations were reluctant to get involved. Some were just friends of Argentina, others didn't want to upset the balance. The civil fleet vessels under the STUFT agreement were not fitted with reverse osmosis systems, and so potable water was an issue for their crews. As mentioned previously, of course, there was a midway stop station, Ascension Island. Let's take a look. As we pan out, we can really see the scale of how small the island was at 6,900 kilometers south of the UK. Ascension Island was still a critical part of the logistics footprint, so let's take a look at this midway aerial refueling station. Let's take a look at this tiny island. I mean, it's just amazing to pan out and just see it's not even a drop in a bucket in the middle of the Atlantic. And it looks like it's about halfway between Africa and South America too. But unfortunately, both of these continents were off limits due to political constraints. Ascension Island is a British territory at 6,900 kilometers, as mentioned, from the UK and 6,100 kilometers from the Falkland Islands. So it does have a 3,000 meter airfield, which can accommodate most aircraft, but it had limited facilities and taxiways as of 1982. Apologies for the poor imagery here, but there's not much rendered. Ascension was used primarily for fuel storage in the RAF-based operations from Ascension. The RAF became very precise in the management of mid-air refueling, as the C-130 only had a range of 3,200 kilometers, and of course the C-130 was used as a primary platform for airdrop missions. Hercules transports were fitted with auxiliary fuel tanks to extend their range by several hundred kilometers, so that helped. So that in combination with the aerial refueling made airdrop missions a daily occurrence from Ascension. So Ascension was extremely valuable. Unfortunately, due to its limitation of having no fixed port facilities, it had far less value as a surface level base. So let's fast forward a little bit and let's move back down to the Falklands. So go out, we'll move the 6,100 kilometers down to the Falklands. So once the Canberra, the Fearless, and the Intrepid arrived to the Falklands, some cross-decking or cross-leveling of troops occurred because it was a security risk, a defensive measure, to move these formations throughout the fleet. So there were three formations, the 40th Commando, the 42nd Commando, and the 3rd Para, that were all essentially on these three vessels. So what they did is they cross-decked them or cross-leveled them throughout the fleet. The amphibious landings were facilitated through the LSLs with mexafloats or causeway sections, as commonly known. Combat service support troops remained afloat until the beachheads were secured and a brigade maintenance area and refueling point was selected. Once selected and then established, a pull system for supplies would be employed to closely regulate needed supplies. The BMA would not be full service, meaning that major repairs or machining would not occur ashore. Very minimal level of services were occurring ashore, nor would level 3 medical care be conducted ashore. So the BMA would establish a field dressing station and just do first aid and minimal medical patch-up of the troops. So severe injuries, the critically wounded would be evacuated to the hospital ship Uganda. The buildup of the BMA and other sites was conducted largely by helicopter sling load operations from 11 vessels across the fleet. The BMA and all of the resupply points were on the west coast of the East Island. So this is the East Island for orientation. San Carlos would be the primary amphibious landing spot. You can see the inlet right here. That led them up the Cantera de Arena, and then they followed. We'll go ahead and follow the path, but first let's measure the distance from Port San Carlos over to Stanley, knowing that Port Stanley was the objective. So this was the town, this was the prize, this is where the Falklanders were actually being held hostage, if you want to use that as a loose term, by the Argentines. So if we measure the distance from the amphibious landing point, staging area, over to Port Stanley, we're looking at roughly 83, between 83 and 85 kilometers, which is about 55 miles. So let's take a look at the elevation. Let's take a look at the YOMP that the Marines, so little factoid, the YOMP is a term roughly equivalent to U.S. military's RUC, So a yomp is a slang term describing a long distance loaded march using rucksacks. So they had the ruck, and we'll talk about the loss of the Chinooks that turned this into a forced march. So if we follow that, that line that I drew was straight line distance. Of course, they're not going to follow that, but added to that, the variation in terrain, the difficult terrain, because a lot of it was bog and marsh, difficult jagged rocks as they got closer to Stanley. So let's take a look at, this is the general route that they followed. And then, of course, you can see they had to deviate south as they got close to this inlet here. So that would probably add another couple of miles around this. And then they came to, this is one of the final mountains right here. I forget the name of the mountain. But I know it was seizing this key terrain right here was a significant aspect of the maneuver, one of the final maneuver objectives. And then finally they got over to Stanley. So all in all, it probably ended up closer to 60 to 65 miles, or rather probably 95 to 100 kilometers. So I thought it was important to take a look at the terrain, and I'll explain why. So after the land campaign started, the Atlantic conveyor was struck by an Exocet ship missile, and this was one of the only major victories of the Argentines. This strike cost the task force, though, the British task force, 3 Chinooks or CH-47s, which would have been used to move troops closer to Stanley and across all this difficult terrain here. They also lost 6 Essex helicopters, so just a major blow to the land campaign with major rotary wing losses. So that shifted the planners into COA B, which was this lengthy yomp over difficult terrain with cold weather and high winds. And so a lot of this, as described, I haven't been down there, but as described, I've read a couple of books and a paper. If you've ever walked in a bog, you kind of sink in, your boots, you get stuck in the mud, which makes walking laborious after a little time. So imagine doing that over a couple of days with 50 pounds on your back. I think we'll close for now and dive deeper on logistics in the next installment with a look at the expansion of ground forces, the deployment of the Queen Elizabeth II, and the positioning of the Rapiers. Then we'll transition into the land campaign and finish up by covering the maritime and air domains. In this installment, we covered the impressive mobilization campaign conducted by the Joint Task Force and the use of Ascension Island as a refueling station. We also touched on some early positioning upon task force arrival and a preliminary terrain analysis for the upcoming foot march. Thanks for watching, and as always, I appreciate your feedback. Let's keep the discussion going. See you next time.